Olá a todos e a todas, sejam muito bem-vindos e bem-vindas à Luta Sem Fronteiras. Essa é mais uma edição aqui do nosso quadro de entrevistas e conversas sobre temas importantes da nossa contemporaneidade, para trazer debates internacionais e reflexões sobre a conexão entre as lutas no mundo contemporâneo. Nosso convidado hoje é David Broder, que além de editor e tradutor da Jacobin Europa, tem também um livro lançado aqui no Brasil recentemente, Primeiro, eles tomam Roma, como a Extrema-Direita conquistou a Itália após a operação Mãos Limpas, da editora Autonomia Literária. David, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you.
We're very excited to have you and listen to you. And of course, we're also very worried about what's happening in Europe in general, but specifically in Italy since the last election. And my first question to you is really related to this. I mean, Fratelli d'Italia had 4% of the vote in 2018, and it went to 26%, getting Meloni prime minister in a coalition with Fratelli d'Italia, the Berlusconi party, and the Liga from Salvini. But for us, looking from the outside, it really interests us to understand what explains such expressive and quick growth from Fratelli d'Italia, and if it's very different from Forza and from Liga, and in any case, how Meloni's government is accommodating all these right-wing groups in the current government?
Mm-hmm. Well, in terms of the sudden rise of Fratelli d'Italia, I think there's two things to consider. One of which is that the previous government, led by Mario Draghi, former central banker, was a so-called national unity government which united everything from centre-left, the Democrats, to the hard right, Matteo Salvini's Lega. And Giorgia Meloni's party, Fratelli d'Italia, was the only party not in the coalition, not in the government. So it very much enjoyed the ability to pose as the only opposition, to criticize the government in all sorts of contradictory ways, and basically kind of hoover up the support of people dissatisfied with the government. In all of the Italian elections in the last 3 decades, the incumbent government has lost the election. This was no different. So I think we saw, in particular, and from the evidence we have, that voters from the Lega and also voters from Silvio Berlusconi's party, also a right-wing party called Forza Italia, they basically defected to Fratelli d'Italia, Meloni's party, and that was the main reason for its sudden rise. Most of its votes had voted for the Lega only 3 or 4 years ago. This brings me to the second explanation of its strength, which is that the overall right-wing vote hasn't actually grown and is at basically the same levels in percentage terms it's been at since the 1990s. The real change, the real sort of sudden breakthrough of a post-fascist party actually happened then in the first Berlusconi government in 1994, which was the first to include the party then known as Alleanza Nazionale, and which is the predecessor of Fratelli d'Italia. So that's a party of fascist tradition, which really traces its history back to sort of Mussolini-era fascism. And already in the 90s, it was in government for the first time. And basically over the last 30 years, we've seen it become totally normalized. I think you alluded in the question to how different is Fratelli d'Italia to these other parties that have been in government recently, because often when parties like the Five Star Movement or the Lega have entered government or look like they're about to enter government, there's been a lot of sort of excitement in international media, like, oh, these are populist parties that are going to tear up the European Union and this kind of thing. And those parties didn't do that, and it was wrong to expect they would. And again, with Fratelli d'Italia, it's not seeking to explode Italy's place in the EU or something like that. Really, what it is a party that wants to defend Italy's place in the international order, show it to be a US ally against Russia and China and such like, while also mounting a very intense war on its domestic opponents, either the left-wingers, who it habitually calls communists, or immigrants. It has various ideas that there's a kind of globalist plot to replace white Italians with Muslims and Africans and this kind of thing. So I think it's not sort of economically radical or going to set Italy against the EU and US. Nothing like that is likely at all. But certainly we're going to see, and we are already seeing, an intensification of a kind of nationalist politics, a racist politics, one obsessed with the family and so on. And it should be said also, actually, a policy which is very harsh on low earners and welfare.
Yeah, my follow-up question would be exactly in those lines. I mean, one would expect that once in power, Meloni would try to at least appear moderate, right? As well not to be isolated in the whole process in Europe. However, we've been seeing aggressive and very racist takes towards migration, as you mentioned. She was even denying there's NGO rescue boats to dock in Italy, causing this international incident with friends, but also other measures against the street parties, or even rehiring health workers that weren't vaccinated. So things that we know very well in Brazil from our own ultra-right government. So my question would be in the lines of what you were saying. How is this reactionary agenda operating in line with the big money interests in Italy? And at the same time, how is it coordinated with the far right internationally?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the idea of, often, of course, journalists and political scientists will talk about a party like Fratelli d'Italia, and they'll say, well, is it going moderate or is it going to become mainstream? And I guess I kind of wonder, well, what does the mainstream right look like today? For example, like in Italy, it's often said, oh, well, maybe left-wingers think Fratelli d'Italia is extreme and they'll try and associate it with fascism and its past. But after all, Giorgia Meloni is invited to speak at events like CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference in the United States, or she's head of a European party called the European Conservatives, but which also includes other far-right parties like Vox in Spain and so on. So I think that in the international far right, the boundaries between the sort of so-called normal conservative parties like the US Republicans and British Tories, and then parties of a kind of collaborationist or fascist past, I think the boundaries between those have collapsed. I think that the fact that Fratelli d'Italia comes from a fascist tradition basically no longer delegitimizes it in the international right, and nor does the fact that it engages with conspiracy theories about ethnic replacement or COVID vaccines and so on. So I think what we actually see instead is that the radicalism of its discourse and program is confined to certain policy areas. So like I said before, not really to things like foreign policy or questioning Italy's place in the euro, but these kind of culture war issues. And I think I'd emphasize that culture war shouldn't just be considered as a kind of euphemism for like racism and sexuality and so on, but the culture war is also about economic issues. So a good example is the fact that Meloni wants to get rid of job seeker benefits, which were introduced in 2019. So it's a monthly payment for people who can't find employment, which was introduced by the Five Star Movement when it was in government. And Fratelli d'Italia promised before the election to get rid of this. And now it's going ahead with that. And what they argue is, well, what Meloni said in her sort of Facebook broadcast a couple of days ago, work can take you anywhere, whereas benefits just leave you lying on the sofa. So there's this kind of idea which is being promoted by the party and its intellectuals and media outriders, which is basically welfare payments encourage laziness. Poor people are taking advantage of it. They're playing the system. The reason why Italy is struggling economically is because there's not a culture of work. So we also see this in things like the education minister talking about the potential for schools to basically prepare workers, and that even from primary school, so even the youngest children should be prepared in a culture of hard work, discipline. He talked about the value of social humiliation in preparing people to be model citizens. So what we actually see from the far right in government is an almost kind of Victorian or Dickensian idea of austerity and hard work, cutting welfare, opposing things like the minimum wage and so on. And these kind of reactionary ideas are obviously perfectly compatible with the interests of the richest parts of Italian society. Of course, in general, it's true that large sections of the Italian ruling class, and certainly the upper middle classes, would vote for more liberal parties than Fratelli d'Italia. But I see nothing in Fratelli d'Italia's program which is somehow incompatible with the interests of Italian capitalism or anything like that. It's a party which, as well as its racism and chauvinism, has free market economic ideas with a certain nationalist touch. But yeah, I mean, it's a party that is open about its intention to get rid of the existing welfare.
I read in an interview or listened to a podcast of yours in which you said that the war in Ukraine allowed Meloni to get normalized in Europe, in a sense that there's strong positions condemning Russia and zero wars on NATO, put them on a table that maybe they wouldn't have in the current context. So I would like if you could explain more this analysis and how this is also coordinated with, of course, Hungary and Poland, but also those groups that aren't in power yet. You mentioned Vox or even Le Pen's parties in France. How is all these groups reorganizing around Ukraine, and how is the ultra-right reformulating its international coordination in this context?
Mm-hmm. Well, in the European far right, there have always been some parties that have much closer relations with Russia. The most obvious case is the Lega, or Lega Nord, as it was once called, led by Matteo Salvini, which openly made an alliance with United Russia, which is the main pro-Putin party in the Duma, is widely considered to have received funding from this party in Russia as well. Also, if we look at, say, Marine Le Pen in France, has made very effusive and positive comments about Putin's Russia, both as a kind of civilizational model, so a Christian and basically ethnically homogenous, or certainly one dominant group. So basically, this is a kind of conservative and Christian state, and also one which stands up to US hegemony. There are other forces in the European far right who have not done that, and I think in particular in 2021, Mateusz Morawiecki, who's the Polish prime minister, tried to create this kind of all-European far-right alliance, including people like Salvini and Le Pen, but also Meloni and so on. And this thing about the divide over Russia was a big problem. It was a big problem in Polish domestic politics and stopped the alliance happening. And then the war has made it even more difficult. So I think that in a certain light, the war has also driven a certain division between the parts of the European far right that look to Hungary specifically, Viktor Orban's government, which is basically the most pro-Russian or least supportive of Ukraine in the European Union, and those which are instead closer to the Polish government, which is a party called Law and Justice. Law and Justice, the Polish party of government, is in Meloni's group in the European Parliament. So I think even though in general it's often sort of used as a sort of liberal sort of point or a set of arguments against the far right, is basically to associate the European far right with Russia, with Russian influence, and there are certainly some signs of this. But Meloni's party, Fratelli d'Italia, actually doesn't quite have so much that tradition as the Lega, as Salvini's party, or the French Rassemblement National. You can certainly find examples of Meloni saying positive things about Putin in the past, but there just isn't the same practical collaboration. There's very little evidence of any kind of financing or real support from Russia for her party. So attempts to sort of smear her in that sense didn't work. I think also what needs to be said, though, is that Italy, like, you know, there was a business summit in soon before the election. It's called Cernobbio. It's like the Italian version of the Davos summit, the World Economic Forum. And at it, Meloni said, in order to be internationally credible, Italy needs to support Ukraine, but it won't make much difference on the battlefield. So I think what she says is true, but really it's something true about her party itself, which is that for Fratelli d'Italia to support Ukraine was necessary in order for it to be seen as a kind of legitimate party of government, one that could have reasonably good relations with other European Union governments and so on, and indeed with Washington. But Italy really doesn't count very much in international politics, and the Italian military and economic support for Ukraine is much less important than countries, for example, like Britain or France, even though those countries have, you know, similarly sized economies. So I think symbolically, within the world of sort of the EU and the US alliance, it was symbolically important that Fratelli d'Italia should take the stance it has, which is of, you know, total commitment to support for Ukraine. But in reality, that also hasn't cost it very much. I think it's a more or less easy stance for it to take. And actually, one of the ironies was that in the build-up to the election, when there was some sort of international press coverage, very critical of Meloni and, you know, the party's fascist roots and so on, I think actually the main focus of it wasn't so much critical of Fratelli d'Italia and Meloni, but rather, oh, she has this ally, Salvini and the Lega, who maybe can't be trusted to support Ukraine. So I think the question of whether or not you are really on side with Ukraine has kind of replaced fascism versus anti-fascism within a certain kind of liberal mainstream discourse about what parties are or are not extremist.
David, I would like first to go a little bit back and referring to your book published here by Autonomia Literária, Primeiro, eles tomaram Roma, como a Extrema-Direita conquistou a Itália após a operação Mãos Limpas. There you show how the far right in Italy actually benefited from the context generated by the Operation Clean Hands in the 90s. And this anticipates, of course, a scenario that we know very well in other countries, especially in Brazil. I mean, Sergio Moro himself, the judge from Lava Jato, praised the Clean Hands operation, and I mean, it openly says it was an inspiration for him. So if you could explain briefly how this anti-system atmosphere is generated and how it is still alive, and what lessons could be learned to deal with the growing lawfare that operates all around the world, but especially in Latin America, opening room for the far right today.
Well, one thing I'll say is that, you know, I often say that Italy is a kind of foresight, or offers a perspective on processes which are happening all over the world. Because I think that what happened in Italy in the early 1990s really concretizes and brings together a lot of the broader political shifts we're seeing in most Western democracies. This is because you have, at the same time, the clean hands corruption trials, which destroy the existing political parties, all of them. Destroys the Christian Democrats, destroyed the Socialists. The Communist Party had already dissolved at the end of 1991. Then you have, together with that, in the same political moment, let's say 1992, you have also the creation of the European Union, and basically Italy setting on the course to join the European single currency. And at the same time, you have a lot of this kind of neoliberal triumphalism, the end of the Cold War, the end of grand ideologies. So you have the basically judges and technocrats and economists and central bankers taking over the political field. And the collapse of what had previously governed politics, which was like mass parties, democratic organizations, and so on. So in this initial moment, when these judges were getting rid of corrupt politicians, quizzing them on TV, this it's kind of hard to remember now, but in the early 1990s, there was a huge optimism about the idea that this kind of prosecutorial spirit would break up the old bureaucracies, would modernize Italy, would break it out of its sort of stagnant condition, and drag it into the future. And the euro as well was meant to play this role as well. So the questions of economic policy and so on would be basically decided by a European and ideally German bankers who would know best and who would make Italy so a normal country like Germany. So all of these recipes basically produced disastrous effects. Even at the level of sort of getting rid of corruption and so on, it didn't work, because basically it replaced mass democratic parties with a kind of deserted political field where those who already had most power were best able to conquer power through electoral means. So the best example of that, of course, is Silvio Berlusconi, who, even without a party organization, even without real supporters, was able to use his media, private media ownership, in order to conquer the elections in 1994. And basically be the hegemonic leader for most of the next 2 decades. So while the initial promise of clean hands, of getting rid of old party bureaucracies and so on, was meant to make institutions more transparent and democratic and so on, instead, what we actually see is that the institutions become less responsive, because there's not the collective organizations, there's not the parties, there's not the battle of political programs that can actually generate a healthy democratic competition. Instead, and I'm saying this in an extreme summary, but instead what we've seen is Italian citizens ever less able to control what's happening politically, less able to organize, less able to sort of mobilize for alternative ideas of social change and so on. So this also has the effect that less Italians take part in democracy at all. So actually the recent election in September had only 64% voter turnout, whereas say in the 70s or 80s, it was often above 90%. I don't know Brazil too well, because I spent just a few weeks there recently, but haven't studied it closely. But to draw a rough comparison, I think what's interesting in the contrast between the two moments, let's say the 1990s in Italy and the 2010s in Brazil, is that with all the limits that the Lula and Rousseff governments had and so on, in Brazil, you still, even when there was the Moro stuff and the coup and so on, you still have mass organized movements. You have big parties and social organizations. There was resistance at the time, and then we had the election victory recently. There was a kind of fight back. And I think in the Italian case, what happened instead was that because the leaders of what had been the Communist Party, the leaders of the left, were in fact the most enthusiastic partisans of this kind of liberal technocratic takeover of politics. So they actually totally demobilized their own side. the left kind of destroyed itself. The Brazilian case obviously is a lot more, obviously Brazil is much more like unequal than Italy, but also there's like a lot more social conflict, but there seems to be more kind of potential inherent in the situation. Whereas I think in Italy, the whole idea of political change or organizing to achieve anything is very narrow. So instead we only have this sort of political struggle around these kind of identity issues.
Well, let's hope some of the more progressive winds from Latin America will arrive to Italy soon. And I thank you very much, David, again. A gente vai encerrar, então, mais esse episódio de Luta Sem Fronteiras. Ele também vai estar disponível numa versão impressa na Revista Socialismo e Liberdade, na próxima edição da revista do PSOL. Sigam a Fundação, compartilhem nossos conteúdos, acessem nosso site, tem bastante coisa bacana por ali, e bora nessa construção.